I'm going to name this carefully, because if I name it wrong, you will think something is wrong with you, and nothing is wrong with you. If you are listening to this and you have been noticing self-doubt creeping back in, and if that inner noise has returned after a period of clarity, or if there is just a quiet voice saying, I thought I had moved past this, I want you to hear this first. Nothing dramatic is wrong. You are not spiraling, you are not unraveling, and you are definitely not failing your own work. And I'm saying this as someone inside the questioning, not beyond it. Not as someone who has figured it out and come back to report, but as someone who knows this terrain very well. And there is a very specific kind of discomfort that shows up at a certain stage of growth. And that doesn't feel like panic, and it doesn't feel like collapse. It feels unsettling, like the floor hasn't disappeared, but the map you were using, it no longer explains the territory. And this is where people usually panic, because we have been taught something very misleading. We've been taught that regulation is a fixed state, that once you are regulated, you stay regulated. That clarity, like that feeling clarity, once achieved, it should just remain stable. And that is not how nervous system work. And it is not how truth works either. And the part most people do not talk about is that sometimes the nervous system isn't dysregulated. It is between orientations, and that space, it feels uncomfortable. And it doesn't feel uncomfortable because you are unsafe, but because the old way of understanding yourself, it no longer fits anymore. And the new one, it has not landed to hold you there. So this is why regulation tools suddenly can feel very flat. And because why breath work doesn't do it the way it used to do it, and why you try to ground and the practice doesn't feel soothing anymore, and why you have an inner dialogue with yourself and it gets louder instead of quieter. And here is where people immediately assume that I'm backsliding, I'm losing my progress, and that something is wrong. And just want to say it, nothing is wrong. What is happening is much subtler, and it is also much more important. What is happening is that your system is renegotiating orientation, and that process is not tidy. So I just want to say this directly, and I because I wanted to land. If regulation always felt calm, you would never outgrow yourself. There are moments where the nervous system needs certainty, and there are other moments where it needs space. It needs space for something deeper to reorganize. And this phase often comes after real growth, after insight, after healing, after clarity. Which is why it is so confusing. Because you think, but I've done the work. I know better now, and why am I questioning myself again? Because knowing better doesn't mean you are done becoming. And this is the part I really want to normalize, because questioning yourself is not failure of regulation. It is often a sign that your previous framework has reached its edge. So you might notice that you have a subtle restlessness, or you feel doubt, but not panic. And maybe you feel a sense of not knowing what is next, or an urge to fix that feeling very quickly. And that urge is understandable. But it is also the moment where people rush back into old identities, into old certainty, into old explanations, into the old versions of self-trust that do not longer fit. So if you are here right now in this in between, I want you to hear this clearly. You are not regressing. You are not unregulated. You are not behind. You are standing in a transition most people never stay long enough to understand. And I am not here to rush you out of it. I'm here to sit with you inside of it, because this space, uncomfortable as it is where deeper truth forms. It is where philosophy is born. It's where the next level of coherence begins. So I'm going to slow this down, because nothing needs to be solved yet. Nothing needs to be stabilized. You don't need to get back to who you were. I don't think you want that. For now, it is enough to just recognize that you are not broken, you are not lost, you are in a space where your system is asking a more honest question. So let's talk about the moment regulation stops working, because this is where a lot of people get scared and they start to turn on themselves. You will hear things like, my tools aren't helping me anymore. I don't feel grounded the way I used to, and I'm doing everything right. Everything right. I'm trying, I'm doing, but it is not landing. And the assumption that follows this is almost always the same. Something is wrong with me. But what if that assumption is incorrect? What if nothing is wrong and something simply shifted? So I'm going to define this precisely, because precision here changes everything. And there is a big difference between panic and between quiet unease. Panic is loud. Panic hijacks the body. Panic floods the system with urgency. Quiet unease is different. It is subtle, it is reflective, and it feels more like not knowing than danger. Panic says that something bad is happening. Quiet unease says something no longer makes sense. And there is also a difference between collapse and uncertainty. Collapse feels like falling apart, like you cannot function, like you are losing yourself. Uncertainty doesn't take you out of your life. You still show up, you still function, but something inside feels unanchored. And then there is another distinction, and this one matters. It is the difference between abandonment and liminality. Abandonment feels like leaving yourself. Liminality feels like you're still here, but you're between versions. You're between identities. You're between orientations. Between what was true and what is becoming true. This is usually the moment people misdiagnose themselves. They call it dysregulation, but what's actually happening isn't loss of safety, it is loss of narrative coherence. The story you used to understand yourself through no longer fully explains your experience, and the nervous system does not love ambiguity, so it gets restless. Doesn't get panicked, but it gets restless. And this is why regulation practices can suddenly feel flat. Breath work that once grounded you feels neutral, and somatic practices feels less comforting. Even familiar routines do not land the same way. And people assume I need better tools. I need to regulate harder. I need to get back to where I was. But your tools aren't failing you. They are just no longer meant to carry the whole story. Tools are designed to support stability. They are not designed to answer existential transitions. This is the part that often goes unspoken in healing spaces. We talk about regulation as if it is the final destination, as if once you are regulated, you stay regulated. But regulation is not stasis, it is responsiveness. And sometimes responsiveness means allowing orientation to dissolve before it reforms. If you try to regulate yourself back into an outdated framework, you will feel stuck because your system is no longer asking for calm. It is asking for truth. So this is why forcing grounding just feel like you are suppressing, and why calming techniques suddenly feel dull, and why you feel a resistance to practices that once helped. Nothing is wrong with you. You're not doing it wrong. You're just in a phase where stability is no longer the primary need. Clarity is. But clarity doesn't arrive on command. It arrives through staying present while coherence reorganizes. This is why this phase feels strange. You're not unsafe, but you're not oriented either. And if you do not know this distinction, you will assume you are regressing. You will assume you have lost progress, and you will assume you need to fix something quickly. But if you know what this actually is, something softens. You stop fighting yourself. You stop forcing resolution. You stop trying to get back to a version of you that has already been outgrown. So if you are listening and thinking, yeah, that is exactly it, something dissolved, but it wasn't me, you are right. What dissolved was a story, a framework, a way of making sense of yourself. And this brings me into wanting to talk about Stoicism for a moment, because many of you listening, whether you call it that or not, you have been shaped by it. Even if you've never read a Stoic text, you have absorbed its spirit. Endure, be strong, stay steady, do the right thing regardless of how you feel. And to be clear, Stoicism has given us something invaluable. It taught us endurance when life is unfair. It taught us virtue as an internal compass and steadiness under pressure. Also taught us dignity in suffering. Those teachings matter, especially in a world that often encourages collapse or avoidance, because Stoicism has helped many people to survive, and survival matters. But here is where I want to slow this down. And I want to do it very carefully, because what helps us survive is not always what helps us transform. Stoicism, at its core, is saying, endure and orient to virtue. Stay upright, do what is right, maintain composure. And for certain phases of life, that is exactly what is needed. When chaos hits, when grief overwhelms, when structure is required, endurance stabilizes. But there is a moment, and this is the moment we are talking about in this episode, where endurance alone becomes insufficient. Because endurance can quietly turn into emotional bypass if it skips the disintegration phase. So I'm going to say it again, gently. Endurance become bypass when it doesn't allow what no longer fits to fall apart. This is the misunderstanding. People think that if they just stay strong enough, calm enough, virtuous enough, the discomfort will pass. But sometimes the discomfort isn't asking to be endured. It is asking to be stayed with. Stoicism say, endure and orient to virtue. Alignment by Tuva says, stay with the disorientation long enough for truth to reorganize. Those are not opposing philosophies, they are sequential. Endurance holds you together. Disorientation reorganizes you. If you only endure, you preserve an identity that may no longer be true. But if you stay, you allow something deeper to take shape. And this is why some people feel stuck despite being incredible, resilient. They are strong, they are composed, they are self-controlled, but something still feels off. Stoicism teaches us to rise above emotion. Alignment asks us to listen to it without being ruled by it. There is a difference between those. Endurance says, I can carry this. Presence say, I will stay long enough to understand what this is asking of me. And this is where people often confuse strength with suppression. They mistake steadiness for truth, and they assume that because they can tolerate something, they should. But tolerance is not alignment, and endurance is not integration. The teachers we trust, the philosophers whose work still lives, did not just endure. They stayed inside the discomfort long enough for a new framework to be born. Philosophy doesn't come from staying intact. It comes from staying present while the old orientation dissolves. So, if you are in a phase where your usual steadiness feels hollow, if being strong feels like holding your breath, if virtue alone doesn't answer the questions you are asking, you do not need to be tougher. You do not need to endure harder. You need to stay. Stay curious. Stay present. Stay inside the not knowing without rushing to resolve it. That is not weakness. That is the threshold of deeper truth. This is the part people misunderstand because they think philosophy is born from clarity, from insight, from answers, from people who somehow knew. But real philosophy doesn't come from knowing. It comes from losing what used to work. Every philosophy that has lasted, truly lasted, was born in a moment of disorientation, a moment where the old map stopped making sense. Not confusion in the shallow sense, but the deeper kind, the kind where certainty dissolves, where previous frameworks just collapse, and where the questions no longer have immediate answers. The thinkers we still read today, they didn't just suffer, they outgrew their own understanding, and instead of rushing to replace it, they stayed. They stayed with the not knowing. They stayed with the discomfort of not being able to explain themselves anymore. They stayed long enough for a deeper order to emerge. This is the part that often gets edited out of their stories. We talk about the conclusions, the quotes, the philosophies, of course. But we rarely talk about the corridor they walked through to arrive there. That corridor is quiet, lonely, uncomfortable, and deeply formative. This is where philosophy is actually born, not in certainty, but in the moment where your old orientation no longer works and you don't rush to replace it. Think about it. If your existing worldview still explains your experience, there's no reason to question it, no reason to reorient, no reason to go deeper. So wisdom doesn't arise because everything is going well. It arrives when coherence breaks, when something essential no longer fits. This is why disorientation feels so threatening, because it strips away your identity as someone who knows, someone who understands, someone who has language. And yet, that stripping is what makes space. The most honest thinkers didn't regulate their way out of confusion. They didn't meditate themselves back into certainty or they didn't discipline themselves into clarity. They stayed. They let their previous conclusions fall apart. They allowed the questions to deepen. And that is a very different posture than endurance. It is not about holding yourself together at all costs. It is about remaining present while something reorganizes. This is why this phase feels sacred when you don't fight it, because something real is happening, something alive. Disorientation is not a mistake. It is a threshold. It is a place between what you were and what you haven't become yet. And thresholds are uncomfortable by nature, because they don't offer reassurance and they don't give timelines. They ask for presence, and it is uncomfortable. And this is where people either rush back to old identities or allow a deeper truth to take shape. And I want to say this really clearly, especially if you are in it right now. If you feel like your previous answers no longer satisfy you, that is not failure. That is integrity. If you can't explain yourself the way you used to, that is not regression, that is growth. And if your old regulation strategies don't quite hold you anymore, that doesn't mean you have lost grounding. It means your system is preparing for something much more coherent. But coherent doesn't arrive immediately. It arrives slowly, it arrives quietly, and it arrives after you have been willing to stay without resolution. And this is why this phase can feel lonely, because there is nothing to point to yet. There is no label, there is no identity, there is no clear direction. But it is also why it is powerful. Because what emerges from here is not borrowed, it is yours. Philosophy is not something that you adopt. It is something that forms when you have stayed present long enough for truth to organize itself from the inside out. So if you are here right now, in this space where certainty has loosened, where the old map no longer fits, and where you can't explain yourself, this discomfort might be sacred. Not because it's pleasant, but because it is honest. Let's bring this out of philosophy for a moment, because if you are in this space, you are not thinking about concepts, you're living it. And living it often shows up as questioning yourself, even though you know better. You hear your own voice and think, why am I doubting this again? You might feel a little bit lost and not anchored, like you are moving through your days doing what needs to be done while something deeper feels unsettled. And maybe you're doubting yourself, like, is this still the path for me? Is this still truth for me? Is this still how I want to move now? So a truth that matters right now is that if you regulate too fast, you stabilize something that's meant to dissolve. And I want to talk about why. Regulation is designed to restore safety. It helps the nervous system to settle. It brings things back to its baseline. But when you are in a phase of reorganization, baseline itself is changing. So when you regulate prematurely, you don't return to truth. You return to familiarity. And familiarity often means old identities, old narratives, old orientations that no longer fit the life you are stepping into. And this is why rushing calm can feel wrong, and why grounding can feel like suppression, and why you feel a resistance to getting back to normal. Your system isn't asking to be calmed. It is asking to be heard. Sometimes the nervous system needs uncertainty. It needs slowness. It needs that quiet unraveling. Think about it this way. Before a new understanding forms, The old one has to loosen, and loosening doesn't feel neat. So this is why clarity cannot be forced, because clarity is an outcome. It's not a command. So if you push resolution too early, you cut the process short. You interrupt integration and you preserve structures that are already outdated. And then later you wonder, why does this still feel off? It is not because you didn't regulate well enough, it is because you regulated too soon. This is one of the most misunderstood truths in nervous system work. Not every discomfort is dysregulation. Some discomfort is developmental, and developmental discomfort doesn't need to be eliminated. It needs to be allowed. And this doesn't mean abandoning yourself. It means staying present without forcing relief. There is a difference between supporting yourself and rushing yourself back into coherence. Support says, I can stay while this moves. Rushing says, I need this to be over. And your system knows the difference. If you are in this phase, your nervous system is not broken. It is intelligent. It is recalibrating. It is learning what no longer fits, what can be released, what needs to be reorganized at a deeper level, and that takes time. So if you feel the urge to fix, to soothe, to stabilize immediately, pause. Ask, what is this trying to dissolve right now? What am I being asked to outgrow? This phase doesn't ask for correction. It asks for noticing. Can I notice when I want to escape this feeling? Can I notice the urge to label it, to solve it, or make it productive? Can I notice the tension in my body that wants resolution more than truth? That noticing is presence. Here, curiosity replaces performance. Not how do I get through this well, but what is happening right now? You might notice a tightening somewhere or a softening elsewhere or a sense of grief without a clear story, or maybe just a relief that you didn't expect. None of what you are feeling needs to be fixed. And after this is often when the most important question arises. And that is a question that opens space. Can I stay? What is reorganizing right now? What doesn't fit anymore? Even if I can't name it yet. These are not questions to solve. They're questions to live with. And living with them doesn't look impressive. It looks ordinary. You go about your day, you do what needs to be done, and you let something shift underneath the surface. Bypassing dissolves by allowing yourself to feel uncertain without rushing to regulate it away. By allowing discomfort and stop calling it failure. There is nothing you are doing wrong here. You are not behind. You are not missing a step. You are in a phase where presence is enough. Please, presence is not passive. It is deeply active. It's just not active in a way that can be measured. You don't need practice for this. You don't need a protocol. You don't need a timeline. You just need willingness. You need willingness to stay with yourself even when you do not yet recognize who you are becoming. That willingness is not small. It is foundational. And I want to talk about the return. Not to promise it, not to rush it, just to name something true. Clarity does return, but not as a replica of what you had before. It comes back changed. It comes back less dramatic, less rigid, more honest. The clarity that reforms after a phase like this is not the kind that needs to be defended. It doesn't rely on certainty. It doesn't need constant reassurance. Regulation returns too, but it's deeper, quieter, more spacious. It is no longer something you do. It is something you inhabit. Disorientation reforms as well, not loudly, not with declarations, but in small moments, subtle choices, a sense of this fits or this doesn't. That doesn't require explanation. This is important. You do not come back as the same person, and that is the point. You do not return to who you were. You return with more room, more tolerance for nuance, more trust in not knowing everything at once. This is why rushing the process never works, because what is forming needs space. If you try to force the return, you will rebuild an old structure. You will rebuild a structure that cannot carry what you have integrated. But if you stay present, if you let the phase complete itself, something quieter and more stable emerges. Not excitement, not relief, but groundedness. You start to notice that decisions feel simpler, that boundaries feel cleaner, and that effort feels less strained. You do not need to hurry toward that. It will meet you. The return doesn't announce itself, it arrives through coherence. So if you are still in the middle of this right now, you're not late, you're not stuck, you're not doing it wrong. You are in the part that cannot be skipped. Before we end, I want to stay with you for a moment longer. Not to wrap anything up, not to summarize, but I just want to make sure you're not left alone with something that doesn't need to be carried alone. For some of you, this might be the first time you have experienced disorientation consciously. Before, you might have rushed past it, labeled it anxiety, fixed it, moved on. But this time, you stayed. And that matters. Nothing needs to be solved right now. Nothing needs to make sense yet. You do not need answers. You do not need certainty. Presence is already leadership. Being willing to stay with yourself when clarity loosens is not weakness, it is maturity. It's maturity. You do not have to explain this phase to anyone. You don't have to justify it. You don't have to translate it into something impressive. You are allowed to move gently, to be quieter, to listen more than you speak. If you're about to step back into your day after this, into conversations, responsibilities, routines, you can do so without leaving yourself behind. You do not need to be back yet. You don't need to be certain. You don't need to know who you are becoming. It is enough to stay. It is enough to notice. It is enough to let something reorganize at its own pace. This isn't a pause from your life. It is a deepening of it. So as you go, carry this with you. You are not behind. You are not broken. You are in a phase that asks for presence, not performance, and you do not have to walk it alone. Thank you so much for being here with me, for listening, for staying, and until next time, stay aligned, stay curious, and most important of all, stay true to yourself.